a year or so ago, the British government said that it was going to roll back a set of rules that it had that were about people who lived outside the UK but still had UK tax residence. Under those rules, as they stood at the time, you could book income outside of the UK, and if that income wasn't generated in the UK, then you weren't subject to that taxation. And it meant that a lot of income that was being produced by UK citizens wasn't being taxed and not able to provide decent public services. That report received about 11,000 pieces of media coverage, not just in the UK, but around the world. It was very widely circulated. TJN, Tax Justice Network, dug into the numbers and found that the amount of millionaires that migrated from the UK that year under the threat of those non-dom changes came to 9,500 people. And that in terms of the context of the number of millionaires in the UK at the time, it was 0.3% of millionaires that moved.
Thanks for joining me on the front line today. I'm Gary Payenda, and I'm speaking today with Ed Miller of Siktar. And we're going to be talking about this idea that if you were to make billionaires pay what they ought to, what they owe to society, what their fair share is, that they would all suddenly up sticks and leave. That is a myth, but it's a prevalent myth. And it's everywhere in the mainstream media. And so we're going to talk about, a little bit of truth-seeking on this one. So I've got Ed Miller here with me today. Let me say hi to you, Ed. How you doing?
Kia ora, I'm great. Great to be with you, Gary.
Thanks for joining me. Can you introduce us first off to your organization, Siktar?
Sure. Siktar is the Centre for International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research. We have the really exciting job of pouring through corporate regulatory filings, trying to work out how much profit companies are earning, how much tax they're paying. If they're not paying that much tax, why is that? Where are they booking their profits in this jurisdiction or in other jurisdictions with very low tax rates, and how is that enabled?
Okay, so going after the tax evaders essentially on an international and national stage. Was that fair enough?
Yeah, I mean, we try and work with unions as much as possible to do this work. We see it as crucial, the tax justice discussion, to be a crucial part of the broader discussion of labour justice as well, and bringing those together enhances both of our voices to get a fairer society.
You talk about tax justice, but when I read the papers, I don't really read much about tax justice. I read about how if you pass a capital gains tax, it will destroy wealth. If you pass an inheritance tax, it will destroy society. If you have a more progressive tax setup, perhaps even a wealth tax, all the rich people will run away, leaving you destitute. So how much of that is scaremongering, and how much of it has some plausibility to it?
Most of it is scaremongering. And the very simple kind of explanation or response to that would be, why don't billionaires actually live in Bermuda? People don't go and live in the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands for the lifestyle. Right. Nobody moves to these places, even though they have very low levels of taxation. The millionaire migration idea that if you increase taxes on the rich has been proved a number of times to be inaccurate, and actually is quite disingenuous in terms of the voices that are pushing this argument. So there was a study that just came out a couple of months ago by Tax Justice Network, which is a global tax justice advocacy group. We have a Tax Justice Aotearoa here in New Zealand, which sort of is a partner of Tax Justice Network. But they did a study that kind of picked apart this myth of millionaire migration in the UK context. So to give you your listeners a bit of context, A year or so ago, the British government said that it was going to roll back a set of rules that it had that were about people who lived outside the UK but still had UK tax residence. Under those rules, as they stood at the time, you could book income outside of the UK, and if that income wasn't generated in the UK, then you weren't subject to that taxation. And it meant that a lot of income that was being produced by UK citizens wasn't being taxed and not able to provide decent public services.
I think their
The
term for that was non-dom status, right?
Correct.
Non-domiciled. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it became quite a big issue because the Rishi Sunak, who was the prime minister at the time, his wife had non-dom status, and she said, "Okay, well, I'm going to start paying tax on all my income, regardless of where it comes from." And the Conservative Party said, "Yeah, we're going to roll back we're going to amend the non-dom regime so that all of that income gets taxed in the UK, so that that the UK can provide sufficient public services and so forth." The response to that came in the form of a report said that there was the threat of changing these rules resulted in a massive migration of millionaires out of the
Hmm.
UK. The That story was covered, or that report received about 11,000 pieces of media coverage, not just in the UK but around the world. It was
Wow.
very widely circulated. TJN, Tax Justice Network, dug into the numbers and found that the amount of millionaires that migrated from the UK that year under the threat of that and those non-dom changes came to 9,500 people. And that in terms of the context of the number of millionaires in the UK at the time, it was 0.3% of millionaires that moved.
Wow.
Millionaires hardly ever move because they like living in places with decent public services as well, because if you have decent
Sure.
public services, it means that people aren't beating down your doors begging for money and this kind of thing. The poor aren't going after the rich in kind of the brutal fashion where there is no public services. But TJN's report also found that the firm that released this report, a firm called Henley and Partners, their main business is selling golden passports, selling passports to people in places where they don't have to live so that they can get tax exempt status or reduce their tax burden. This was a business case for them. They were trying to sell a product. Millionaire migration was something that they were trying to prove that existed, so for their own financial purpose. It didn't exist, and the reality is actually that workers move a lot more than millionaires. Workers have to chase the changes in global political
Yeah.
economy. You have to go after where the jobs are. I used to work in Malaysia, and there was an enormous group of undocumented migrants from Bangladesh, from Nepal, from Myanmar. Workers have to migrate from place to place because of the changes in global political economy. Millionaires don't have to, and therefore they stay put because their family is there, their support network is there, their friends are there, and their country club is there as well.
It echoes some of the stuff I've been listening to with Gary Stevenson talking about how this idea that millionaires or billionaires, in that case, can just decide on a whim to move doesn't really marry up with the reality of a billionaire being a billionaire, not because they have some digital numbers in their bank account, but because those assets are real somewhere in the world, right? They own our houses, our industrial complexes, our skyscrapers, and they can't easily. Well, our businesses, they can't easily just shift that across borders. So the more the media just keeps perpetuating this untruth that our billionaires can leave at the drop of a hat, it really just keeps us all being afraid of making a better law. And so we give up even before we've started. We already say, "Oh well, can't do a wealth tax. It's too complex. It's too hard. People will leave." We've already lost before we've even begun. It's a bit depressing.
Yeah, I think the part of the context here is that lobbying is quite cheap for a billionaire. Lobbying to try and get the kind of rules that you want in terms of the tax
Right.
rules that you want is relatively cheap. It doesn't cost a huge amount of money relative to the cost that having to pay some tax on the wealth that you've accumulated would be. So why not do it? And that's why you get this kind of echo chamber. But this TJN report that I mentioned is not the only example. There's another report that came out just last month, which was based on US study and found that wealth taxes within certain states don't actually encourage people to move out of those states, not even having to leave the US, just going state to state. Those wealth taxes do not encourage migration in any reasonable shape or form, but the effect that they do have is that they have a significant impact on public revenue. They do result in a lot of money being created. And one more example in that respect is Norway. Norway has a wealth tax, and that wealth tax exists at both the national and the sort of local level. So it's broken up into two chunks. In 2019, I think it was, Norway increased that wealth tax. And I think they increased it on the local side. So, for the local infrastructure expenditure and that kind of thing. There was a couple of billionaires that moved, and those billionaires that moved were very widely reported in the press. Most of them happened to be in the ECE sector, so running kindergartens. And there's a report on our website about called Kindergarten Landlord, about some of the large landlords that now own the real estate under which all those services are delivered, because they separate out the service delivery from the real estate. Can get into that separately. But
is that in addition to the Best Start scandal, like in New Zealand?
It's the same.
This is like same thing.
Pretty much the same thing. We could get into Best Start, and I'd love to talk to you about that. But I probably need to do a bit of reading or reminding myself.
Yeah, no, we'll do that. We'll do that another time.
Do that separately. But Norway did increase that wealth tax. They found a couple of billionaires left, not that many. But the big change that they had was a big jump in the revenue that tax collected as a result of that. Wealth taxes actually work. They have worked in all the very few examples that we've had, but the lobbying against those is relatively cheap relative to the amount of income that they bring in. So billionaires pay for that lobbying because it doesn't cost them anything.
I think what's interesting is we have a historical control going back when the top marginal tax rates were 2 to 3 times as high as they were now, and the world did not end. Surprisingly, well, perhaps not surprisingly, it was a time of thriving, of growth of the middle class, the likes of which the world had not seen, when the wealthy paid their fair share. But starting in the 80s, probably, we just got into this horrendous spiral of allowing the incredibly wealthy to evade taxes with the complicity of government. Governments smiling and looking the other way, governments passing ever weaker laws and always fighting to decrease the tax rates and the tax take on the wealthy. And the sad bit is we seem not to have learned. I mean, when I was younger, everyone realized that trickle down didn't actually work because we had lived through the failure of it. We saw what happened, but now somehow we've circled around to trickle down. Maybe it has a different name this time, but it's essentially beating a dead horse of this idea that if you give billionaires the most tax privileged position in society, if you just cut taxes and expectations on them so low that it's not just they're not paying their fair share, they're almost not paying a share, to think that wouldn't have a corrosive effect on your entire society and your ability to afford roads and schools and healthcare it seems delusional. But that seems to be back where we are with our government literally pushing the wrong direction in this. Do you see hope? Do you see hope, Ed?
Do I see hope? Yeah, I find it very hard not to be hopeful. Just because whenever I talk to people, they always agree. Almost every kind of working class person or middle class person that I talk to about these issues seems to find no problem with the idea of taxing the wealthy, no problem with the idea of funding public services properly, no problem with the idea of having decent investment in public infrastructure.
But those people aren't getting half-page articles in the newspaper the way the Mowbrays do, for example. When these big, rich business leaders want to make their point, they seem to have a megaphone, right? The newspapers are more, and again, who owns the newspapers? These are, well, right now we have the Herald being bought out by a Canadian billionaire. it becomes an echo chamber of we can't make the rich pay what they ought to pay. It would stifle innovation, which is just laughable given everything you and I have just spent the last 30 minutes talking about. But you are hopeful. You do see some rays of sunshine out there in the bleak winter. What do you think our viewers could actually do about this?
Next time there is some kind of proposal about a wealth tax and you see any discussion coming from the right-wing parties or even from any political party saying, well, we can't raise taxes because the millionaires are going to disappear because it will stifle wealth, make your MP realize how garbage that is. Find the TJN reports, find the other reports that I'll mention, and I'll share links with you about all of that information, and print off copies and go down and say, what's wrong with this? This is the evidence. These are the facts. Why are you struggling to get your head around the facts? Because the rationale that you guys have put forward in the corporate media doesn't seem to make sense. It completely defies logic and reason. I'm really grateful that you have this platform and that there's more and more people like yourself that are picking up an ability to create an alternative to the corporate media, because the newsrooms are dying, unfortunately. Journalists are rushed off their feet. The number of journalists doing journalistic work in this country has fallen dramatically, like to a quarter of what it was a decade ago, and journalists just can't keep up. It's really easy just to print off a press release and rewrite it about how such and such billionaire has managed to get a helipad consented for their house. That's an easy story and it sells papers, but it doesn't make the kind of society that we need to. So I'm really grateful, Gary, that you have this platform and that you're giving people the ability to speak directly to our viewers and to learn about the value of public services and decent public investment.
Well, thanks, Ed. This is small time stuff, right? I don't really know what I'm doing, but the messages are important, and the idea that people would not know about the work you and your organization does is a bit tragic. I mean, really, we are all caught up in news that's become almost like reality TV, just vapid, and it's almost like a distraction from the actual issues that need to be dealt with in real life. I mean, people have trouble affording groceries. People are having trouble affording rent or mortgage or healthcare. And the response from the top level of society, right, the people who govern and lead us, is like, let's just privatize it. Let's sell off, state assets. Let's degrade our public services just a little bit more because maybe a private equity corporation can make some profit off of it. Maybe if we privatize urgent care, if we privatize school lunches, we can have a prison food corporation supply lunches to our kids and make $100 million revenue off of that. So these are bleak times, and I feel if people don't talk about it outside of kind of corporate media, there isn't really much hope, because I can't see corporate media going along with these sorts of messages. I mean, they're owned by billionaires now. And it wasn't always like that. I mean, I'm old enough now at 50 to remember a time when there was public interest journalism and sort of state-supported media that did a good job. And now it's just, well, I mean, there are cutbacks now, right? This government is decimating public journalism. Quite sad, quite sad. So sorry to be bleak, Ed, but thank you for the work you do and what Siktar does. And we'll put links to your organization in there. I think all of our conversations always point out how important the idea of collective bargaining is. You and I, as workers, have no power by ourselves. We can put a little podcast together, right? We can talk about this as friends, but the ability to really change the levers of power are not there. And really, collective bargaining is in some ways our only hope of getting some power and a voice out there to counteract the incredibly wealthy voices that are overrepresented. So yeah, support your union is what I would say, and support governments that support unions, because without them, this is going to be a race to the bottom. Thanks, Ed. I've taken up a lot of your time today, but I thank you for the work you do. It's huge, and I'll be happy to have you on anytime when your next big research article comes out. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks so much, Gary. I really love the work that you do. Thanks for giving us a platform to be able to do this, and thanks for always supporting, the union movement and the voice of working class people. We're nothing except for when we act together.